Right, so we're going to delve into that 80 new members of the NEC in just a few moments. But of course, the newly elected Secretary General of the ANC is Phala Phala. He says that President Cyril Ramaphosa will likely now think about a cabinet reshuffle. He says the new NEC is going to meet to discuss organizational issues next year. However, he says the Phala Phala matter has been dealt with by the party and will only be handled if it arises in the future.
Phala Phala has been dealt with in Parliament, and if anything that arises, we will deal with it as and when it comes up. From where we are seated, the matter has been handled by the public protector, has been handled by the law enforcement agencies. We will watch that space closely and then process it accordingly in the organization.
I'm joined now by political analyst Sanusha Naidoo. Sanusha, thanks so much for joining us. Let's start with how the ANC is managing this Phala Phala issue. Before the conference started, we were awaiting the Integrity Commission's report, the ANC Integrity Commission's report into Phala Phala, also, in fact, into Digital Vibes, but we're most particularly interested in what it had to say about Phala Phala. Days before the conference, we were told, well, that will be released during the conference. It was released, but the president has seen it. No one else seems to have engaged with it. Certainly nothing public has really come out. And then we hear this statement from Phala Phala, sort of suggesting, well, it's dealt with for now. What do you make of the ANC's handling of this?
Good evening, Sally, and good evening to the viewers. I think the way in which they've approached this has been really a PR disaster for them, in terms of the fact that even though it was quite a controversial and a serious issue that surrounded the president, he survived the parliament vote. He survived in terms of the way in which he got re-elected. The numbers seem to suggest that it was a good set of confidence that people had in terms of him. But we also got to unpack that in terms of structure, issues, contestation between PECs and their delegate branch representatives and all of that. But the key issue here is it's not going away. It's there. And the more you try to procrastinate around it, you're not going to actually deal with it, because it remains a serious cloud over the presidency, both in terms of the Republic and in terms of the ANC. And of course, the challenge then is now the NEC, the newly elected NEC, has to deal with this. And of course, that's going to be critical in terms of what some of its first business should be. But remember, this whole conference is so unprecedented in the fact that, in my kind of understanding since 1992, I've never seen a conference with unfinished business. So they're coming back in a hybrid form on the 5th of January to actually deal with issues on resolutions, etc. And remember, the step-aside rule, the questions about what happens to members that are in the ANC in terms of dealing with some of these challenges around the integrity question, etc., is something that the Integrity Commission has to think about, and whether or not the NEC has to think about these rules and how they deal with it. So it's not going away for now, but I think the challenge here is whether or not the optics around it will actually be something that they will able to navigate in terms of branding, in terms of implication, and in terms of how the general public of opinion would respond to it.
Yeah, and for a party that says it's renewing and wants to restore trust with the voters, having any questions like this lingering over the president of the party, and also, of course, if we look at the newly elected NEC, we see a lot of names on that list, people implicated in the State Capture Commission. I want to circle back to that in just a moment, and I want to start by talking about the people who didn't make the NEC's highest decision-making body during conferences. And we have got some top cabinet ministers who didn't make it onto the NEC. Among them, Pravin Gordhan, Naledi Pandor, Thulas Nxesi, David Mabuza, the country's deputy president, and of course the Speaker of Parliament, Nosiviwe Mapisa-Nqakula. She also didn't make it to the NEC. Now, speaking to Sipho Mandla-Goge earlier, he said, you know, the ANC will always say you don't have to be on the NEC to qualify to be made a cabinet minister. They can be totally separate processes. But does it weaken those cabinet ministers? Does it mean even more that we are likely to see a cabinet reshuffle?
Well, this is something that has always been an interesting question, but also one that raises the issue of what President Ramaphosa needs to do in order to strengthen the kinds of issues he wants to pursue in his second term. Now, we know that the challenge of reshuffle is really critical in terms of making some of the big decisions around making your state-owned enterprises more for a lack of a better word, efficient. And of course, the question of dealing with issues around your economic development, your growth strategy, etc. The names you mentioned are interesting names because these are some of the ministries that we have to think about. So Praveen Gordhan in public enterprise, Naledi Pandor in foreign affairs, or what we call international relations and cooperation. We also have the Minister of Department of Trade and Industry, Ibrahim Patel, and of course you mentioned the Deputy President. For me, I think it has to be a critical kind of understanding of where the reshuffle happens. Do we read more into the fact that these individuals have not made it into the list, or do we read into the fact that these are individuals that will play a much more critical role in terms of how they go forward as possible envoys for the president outside of the cabinet? Now, in the case of, for example, labor, etc., the other thing that we have to ask ourselves is how do you actually rationalize this cabinet? Not only in the context of efficiency and effectiveness and having the right ministers in the right portfolio, but also in terms of bringing down the kind of cost to the budget that this cabinet actually has, the cost benefit factor, because a lot of it is duplication of services. Also, one of the other issues for me is that some of these ministries are not talking to each other. They work in complete silos. And I think the other name to mention on the list is Bladen Zamande, who actually comes from the SACP. He hasn't made the NEC, but also in terms of the fact that what does this mean for how do we deal with the higher education crisis as well. So I don't want to actually try and speculate before the new year what the reshuffle will look like. But I think there are certain other members as well in terms of how you're going to see this move forward. I mean, the other thing that I want to bring up just as a side point, but of course a very important one, is if you look at who was the first on the NEC in terms of the number of votes, and you look at where Zweli Mkhize was with the number of votes, that for me was telling in terms of how much Zweli won, in terms of the vote that he got for president and where he was sitting on the NEC list.
Yeah, he came in at number 16, and Sihle Zikalala, former Premier of KwaZulu-Natal, was number 1. Let's actually dive into that list a little bit. Number 2 on the list, the second highest number of votes, went to Mduduzi Manana, former Deputy Education Minister, seen slapping a woman on video. Malusi Gigaba, implicated in state capture. Andile Longisa at number 11, he of the jug thrower in Nelson Mandela Bay. Zweli Mkhize, we've mentioned, he still has to clear up the digital vibes issue, although, no, he has not yet been charged. Batabile Dlamini, and we know about the whole SASSA debacle. This is a party that says it wants to clean up its act. And even if we look at the top 7, we've got Gwede Mantashe, Nomvula Mokanyane, who have to, they have to answer to the State Capture Commission. They have been implicated, and the president with Phala Phala. What sort of message does this send that the branch members who have these voting rights look at the track record of certain people and go, no, it's okay, I still want to vote for them? What do you think is going on?
In international relations, you've got the survival of the fittest. You've got people who want to essentially make sure that whatever of their interests are in the last kind of throw of the dice, they remain. And I think for me, what's really, really disturbing is that you have a very contested ANC National Executive Council, but you also have a contested top 7. And I think the problem here is that the cloud of controversy is now becoming a serious tsunami for the party. It's just becoming a serious dilemma in terms of whether or not you are able to have that caliber of the kind of cadre you want in terms of the efficiency, the moral compass, the efficacy, but also just in terms of whether or not anybody can stand at the parapet and say anything that will actually say something of note. So in other words, it was all about something and all about nothing. And I think that becomes a critical dilemma for them in the election process, because I always believe that we should not underestimate the electorate. We do know that the electorate can be very astute, insightful, as well as sophisticated in how they interpret the electoral landscape. And I think this is something where all of the stuff that they have to deal with is that, firstly and foremost, is looking at what they have to deal with internally if they want to renew. And the challenge here is what they're going to renew.
Thank you so much for speaking to us, Sanusha. Sanusha Naidoo, a political analyst there.